So here we are going to go over the neuron. Now, the neuron is the fundamental unit of the nervous system, and it's responsible for receiving signals and then transmitting those signals to neighboring neurons. So let's take a look at the key features. We're going to start over here on the left-hand side, and we'll start at the cell body. So the cell body is this central region over here, and it's also referred to as the soma. Now, this is going to be our nucleated region, and this is where we are going to find our organelles, our mitochondria, our Golgi apparatus, so forth. From that cell body, we can see that we have these protrusions or these extensions. Now, these extensions are referred to as dendrites, and these dendrites further branch off into dendritic branches. So you've got the dendrite, and then you have the dendritic branches. Now, these dendrites are responsible for receiving signals from a neighboring neuron. So if I have a neighboring neuron over here, and that neighboring neuron sends it off a signal, the dendrites are the first to receive that signal, and they are going to pass it on to the axon hillock. Now, the axon hillock, it's really pivotal because this is where we will see the summation of different impulses, and the axon hillock will determine if the electrical impulse will be transferred to the axon and go all the way through to the axon terminal. And remember that when we talk about action potentials, they are all or nothing events. And that is why we have that axon hillock. It's the place where all those impulses are going to summate, and then it'll be decided if that action potential is going to move on to the axon. Now, moving forward, the axon. Now, the axon is this long single fiber that's going to connect this one end, the left-hand side of our neuron, to the right-hand side of our neuron, and it's responsible for transmission of that signal. And we can make note that on our axon, we have this yellow structure that is interspaced. This is called the myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath is this fatty insulated layer that's going to cover our axon, and it's kind of like a protective layer for the axon, and it prevents ions from leaking. Now, what's important to note is that the myelin sheath does not continuously extend from beginning to end. It is spaced. Now, these spaces between two myelin sheath layers is called the nodes of Ranvier. So these are the nodes of Ranvier, and these are the myelin sheaths. Now, essentially what happens is that if an action potential is generated, it's going to hop from each of these nodes of Ranvier, and it's going to result in this different type of conduction, which is much quicker, and it's known as saltatory conduction. Now, when we have a myelin sheath present and we have this hopping mechanism of that action potential, this is actually much faster than if we didn't have a myelin sheath present. If there was no myelin sheath, the action potential would have to move along the axon, and that is a much longer path to take rather than to just simply hop from each node to node and reach the axon terminal. Now, the axon terminal is where that action potential, that signal, it's going to pass on to another neuron. Now, the neighboring neuron, what part of that neighboring neuron is going to pick up the signal? Well, remember, it's going to be our dendrites or our dendritic branches, because they're the first ones to receive the signal. Now, that was the overview. Let's take a look at the definitions one more time. So, the neuron. The neuron is the functional unit of our nervous system, and this is the overall structure of our neuron. Then we have dendrites or dendritic branches, which are projections from the soma or the cell body, which are responsible for receiving information from neighboring neurons. So we have our dendrites and we have our dendritic branches. Then we have the soma, also known as the cell body, which is the nucleated region, and it's going to contain the organelles of the neuron. The axon hillock. The axon hillock is the junction between that cell body and that axon, And it's the point at which the external impulses summate before the signal is sent off to the axon. Now, the axon itself is a long single fiber responsible for transmitting the signal, and it connects one end of the neuron to the other end of the neuron. The axon terminal transmits the signal to neighboring neurons, and then of course we have our myelin sheath, which is a fatty insulated layer covering the axon, and it prevents ions from leaking out. And the nodes of Ranvier are those short regions located between the myelin sheaths, and it allows for faster conduction of that action potential, and that faster conduction is known as saltatory conduction. Now, one more thing we're going to go over is what cell type makes up the myelin sheath. We have two different cells. We have oligodendrocytes and we have Schwann cells. Now, both of these cell types make up the myelin sheath, but what's very important is that oligodendrocytes will make up the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, whereas Schwann cells will make up the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. So that's just the distinction between the two. They're both responsible for that myelin sheath, but one is the central nervous system and the other is the peripheral nervous system. And that is the fundamental basics of the neuron, the most fundamental unit of our nervous system.